Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of I Came for Science, a show about sex and reproduction and inclusion in STEM. I'm your host, Laura Surratt. I'm a professor of biology, and I've been studying animal sex for the past 30 years. Please join me as we normalize talking about sex and what we know about it, as well as the journeys of the scientists who study it. Today, at the end of the show, I will be joined by a co-host, Natalia, who's a science communicator and my former student, to discuss this episode. Today, I have the great fortune to talk to my mentor and professor of molecular and biology and genetics at Cornell University, Dr. Mariana Wolfner. Mariana, welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy to have a chance to talk with you.
Hi, Laura, and thanks so much. It's really great to talk with you. Thanks for asking me to talk today.
Yeah, I'm honored to have you here. Could we start by you just telling me about the general area of reproductive biology your research focuses on?
Sure. We study two different areas of reproduction, both of which are around the time when the egg is fertilized by the sperm. So in part of my lab, we study the seminal proteins that enter female animals with the sperm because they're very, very important in fertility of all the animals looked at so far. They facilitate the ability of the female to keep the sperm and the sperm to fertilize eggs, but they also act almost like hormones on the female to change her physiology to promote reproduction. And my lab is interested in what these proteins are, how they work, and how they evolve. Most of our work on that is in fruit flies, but a little bit in collaboration with a colleague, Laura Harrington, is in mosquitoes.
Well, and just to pause there, listeners, so just in case you didn't catch that, it's that proteins from the males are influencing female behavior and physiology. It's wild and cool, and that these molecules interact between males and females. So neat.
It is particularly wild. One question that we're trying to address right now is, how are there even proteins in the female that these male proteins can even bind to? Because it's a completely different animal and they never encountered them before. And I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. I love when there's scientific questions that are unanswered. I think sometimes people think, oh, all scientific questions have been answered already, and yet there's still these huge mysteries out there.
Yeah, as soon as you answer a question, it raises a new question.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. And then the other area of research in my lab, so the seminal proteins are before the egg and sperm meet and combine, but the other area of research has to do with how does an egg transition from an egg to an embryo that can begin to develop. And obviously in most organisms that requires that the egg be fertilized, but it's much more than that. How does the egg finish its division to get a haploid nucleus? And how does the egg start using the molecules that the mother put and stored in it to facilitate early embryo development? Part of my lab studies this process, again, mostly using fruit flies because they have a lot of technical advantages, but also recently we've begun studying it in mice in collaboration with my colleague, John Scimenti.
Oh, interesting. Can you just back up a little and explain what a haploid nucleus is?
Oh, sure. So most animals, including ourselves, are what we call diploid. We have two copies of every chromosome. One comes from the mother and one comes from our father. But when animals reproduce, the egg has to only have one copy of each chromosome so that when it fuses with a sperm, which also has one copy of each chromosome, the embryo will now again have two. When an egg has one copy of each chromosome or a sperm has one copy, we refer to those cells as haploid.
So you have these two different areas that are all about reproduction and how sort of male and female processes and molecules come together to make this into a successful process. Can you tell me what led you to this research area?
Yeah, it was not a straight line. And what led me to the two areas were different. So my training in graduate school and postdoc was in genetics and developmental biology. And I think that I thought of myself and still sometimes do as a geneticist and developmental biologist. The project on how the egg transitions to an embryo that can develop is classical developmental biology. In developmental biology, we ask, how do you go from an egg to an adult? And this is the very, very first step of how do you go from an egg to an embryo. So that has always been an interest of mine for a long time. The seminal protein one was not at all what I thought I would be studying. I was interested in the development of how males and females develop differently, even though they have all the same genes. So what is it that causes a male to develop as a male versus a female to develop as a female, speaking biologically, and about the body and so on. And I, as a postdoc, I studied in flies, one of the genes that, depending on its action, will make a fly develop as a male or a female. It's called double sex, because where it doesn't work, you kind of get a little of both sexes in the same animal.
Interesting.
But when I started my own lab at Cornell, I needed to do something different from that would be my own lab's identity. So we decided to look at what genes the double sex gene controlled that were expressed only in females or only in males. The first genes we found were expressed only in males and made seminal fluid proteins. And we became curious as to what these proteins did, and that led us to that area.
So interesting. Every scientist's path is so different how they come to things. And I also never thought I would be studying seminal fluid proteins. And here we are, right?
Yeah, here we are.
Yeah. And I was always an animal behavior person and really shied away from the molecular biology and genetics. And finally, when I was finishing my PhD, I was like, oh, to be a well-rounded biologist, I really better learn some of that molecular biology and genetics. And so I asked one of my committee members, like, how could I learn that, but still do what I love about male-female interactions related to reproduction? And he said, you apply to the lab of Mariana Wolfner. And that is all I did. That was literally my only postdoc.
That's very sweet.
So it was my way of studying exactly what I was interested in, but also learning the molecular biology.
Which you learned really, really well.
Yeah, it was hard.
And applied to more than just flies. So actually, my lab, I don't normally talk about this, but my lab actually, when we started it, my very first graduate student, Angela Di Benedetto, had her undergraduate degree in biology and psychology, and she really wanted to study behavior. So she joined my lab. We were looking for genes that double sex controlled, but we looked in the brain because she wanted to find something for sex behaviors. And we had a very difficult time. We didn't really find anything. And I think that's probably, we now know that a lot of it has to do more with the wiring than a specific sex-specific gene, although there are a few. But then when we discovered that we had found seminal proteins, we were initially a little disappointed until it was pointed out to us that these proteins change the behavior of female flies. And we were like, great, we can study behavior.
It's funny how life works out. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And what I've always appreciated about your approach is that, like, for me, I saw my lack of molecular biology and genetics as a deficit coming into your lab and didn't think much about the other knowledge that I had of ecology and evolutionary biology and animal behavior. But you're always like, no, we'll teach you the molecular biology and genetics, but you bringing this other thing in is a strength. And I don't think, I haven't met a lot of other scientists who, I'm sure they're out there, but who have emphasized that kind of cross-pollination as much as you do.
Thank you. I think it's really important. And it went both ways. When you came to my lab, I didn't know any behavioral ecology and not a lot of evolution. And I learned a lot of those from you. And also, you had a background in insect biology. And I mentioned briefly, just kind of tossed off the fact that we also work on seminal proteins in mosquitoes with Laura Harrington, but you started that project and we would have never even moved into mosquitoes. I think this cross-pollination is one of the areas where fun science gets done because it pulls together different fields. So I completely agree.
Yeah.
And molecular biology at the level that you need it to do these experiments is not quite, but almost like cooking. It's the recipes and you need to know how to do it, but it isn't really that difficult to teach.
It's nice to hear you say that. I think there's a lot of people who feel overwhelmed by it, but it's really neat to hear someone who's so deeply into it say that. So I would like to back up in your life a bit and hear about your journey through STEM. Like, how did you get to this prestigious position where you're making these huge impacts on the field? And we'll hear more about those later. But yeah, how did this journey start for you?
So different people have different paths, and mine was relatively straight in the sense that even as a young child, I knew I loved biology. And I can even now, in retrospect, see that I love developmental biology and genetics just from the sorts of things I did as a kid. My parents fostered that with books and taking me to museums and all kinds of things like that. My school also fostered it. I went to a school that was all girls, where they part of they taught everything, but they made sure that girls were not afraid of math or science. And so for me, I always wanted to do science. I didn't exactly know how you do it, but I always wanted to do it. It wasn't a late in life decision. So the path of then going to undergraduate to do science and then was pretty straight for me. And then once I was an undergraduate, I saw what one could do. I saw that there could be professors, and I saw that you would go to graduate school and postdoc to get that. So I never thought twice about it. I just kind of went straight through. There were some mentors along the way at every level who made critical differences to me, either in pointing me to what to do, or making me feel like I actually could do it. Among those were my undergrad research advisor, Jerry Fink, and my graduate advisor, Dave Hogness, but there were a lot of others here at Cornell and in high school as well.
Do you have any particular memories of something someone said or did that made you feel encouraged or belonging?
I think the answer is sort of no. There wasn't a specific thing that someone said to me, but the fact that many of these people that I was in awe of listened to me and took me seriously and engaged with me. The two that I mentioned, for example, also Barbara McClintock, who is a Cornell alum and spent some time at Cornell while I was a student. And one of my undergraduate advisor, Adrian Serb, who was another major mentor for me, told me I needed to go talk to her. And I was petrified. And I went and talked to her. And she talked to me like I was a person that could talk with her. I mean, she treated me like a colleague. That sort of thing made the biggest difference to me, not a specific statement that someone said.
I'm so glad you shared that because I think I like to ask that question because I think that there's lots of mentors out there who want to become better at mentoring and more inclusive in their mentoring. And what I find when I ask this question is it's something very simple a mentor could do, right? Like
Very
just
simple.
treating them like a fellow scientist is
Like a fellow
what these,
scientist.
yeah.
Also saying things like, you might want to consider going to graduate school, something like that. But yeah,
Yeah.
just treating them. So I'm going to say something that you may want to erase.
Okay.
But I'm going to tell you a story about the meeting with Barbara McClintock.
Yeah.
So again, my advisor, Adrian Serb, who was her friend and himself a very well-respected geneticist, he had written the textbook that we had in our course. And when she came to visit Cornell and he told me to go talk to her, he knew I was terrified. And he may have said something to her. And when I went in to the office that she was sitting in, she was sitting there behind the desk, very old looking to me, wise woman. I knew who she was. I knew what she had done at Cornell as a student and as a young faculty. So I was petrified. And I walked in, I was probably a sophomore. I walked in and I said hi, and she said hi. And she had a jar of caramels in her office. And she said, "Why don't you take one?" And I mean, if Barbara McClintock tells you to take a caramel, you do. So I took a caramel, and as soon as I started eating it, my mouth was, I couldn't talk because the caramel sealed my mouth shut. And she saw that and she smiled and she said, "Great, now I can talk." And she started telling me
Clever.
about her life and her work.
Oh,
And then by
wow.
the time the caramel had stopped holding my mouth shut, wasn't so scared, and we could talk, and we stayed friends. I would visit her at Cold Spring Harbor over the summers for several years, and we would always have a great time.
That's a great story.
Not
The
sure
caramel effect.
but
I
the
think I do.
caramel effect, yeah.
There were some times when you were the only woman in academic settings as you went through your academic training and conferences, etc. How did that impact you or your science?
Yeah, I think about that sometimes. So I was the only woman in my graduate class, in my graduate lab, other than in my graduate lab, there was a technician who was female, but I was the only female trainee. Same thing when I got to my postdoc lab. And I was the first woman hired in my department at Cornell. So I experienced this several times. And there are a couple things I will say. First of all, I was an undergrad here at Cornell, and without trying to sound all rah-rah about Cornell, Cornell has always had a tradition of being open to people from any group, any gender, any background, anything. It really always permeated the university. It was part of what Ezra Cornell founded it for, and it really was like that. So I didn't feel there were other women, not as many as men, but there were some, and I never felt different when I was here. But as soon as I got to graduate school, where the ratio was different and the culture was different, I felt it very much. There were two things that sort of helped me then. One was I was so sure that I loved doing science that nobody was going to stand in my way. And you know me well enough, Laura, to know that I'm pretty shy and quiet on the outside, but I was pretty determined about this. So I was going to do this, whatever they said and whatever they did. The other thing, and I've given this some thought as well, I think this is correct, is that I'm an immigrant and I'm from a non-American family. We didn't have a television at home. And I think and I went to an all-girls junior and senior high school. And I think that because of all of those, there were a lot of cultural things that might nowadays be considered microaggressions that I didn't even pick up on. I didn't even know to think about these things. I just was me, and I just did what I needed to do. And if someone said something, sometimes someone said something that was pretty blatant, but I think there were other things that I just didn't notice. So sometimes it's good to be oblivious. And then
quotes to live by.
Sorry?
Quotes to live by. Sometimes it's good to be oblivious.
Sometimes it's good to be oblivious.
But I also like the one that you were gonna do. Wait, what did you say again? You were gonna do your science no matter what.
Yeah, no one was gonna tell me not to do it. I wanted to do it. I was curious. I was interested. I loved it. And no one was gonna get in my way, basically.
Right. I love it.
But you can do that in a relatively meek way. You don't have to be barreling in like a large, bear or something. You can just say, fine, I'm just gonna do it.
Yeah.
And then this story, but I'd still like to tell it, that when I was an new assistant professor, that was I also met the guy who eventually I married, and he's a sociologist, and he was really helpful to me in setting some of the gender things that I was encountering in a different perspective. So he told me about the work of a Harvard professor named Rosabeth Moss-Cantor, who had written Men and Women of the Corporation and who studied how institutions work, had talked about how if a group is relatively uniform in some feature or trait, for example, the department I joined was all male faculty, if a single individual who's different joins them, this causes a whole dynamic that causes some systemic issues that the new individual might think was them when it was actually the situation. And what she talked about was to imagine a series of items all labeled X. And if you see 10 or 15 X's, you might notice that one X is bigger, the other X is smaller, one X is is straight, one X is tilted, one X is curlicued, one X is a different color, so on and so forth. And they all look different. As soon as a new item, which we'll represent as an O, joins it, suddenly the differences between the X's become less distinct and they look more different from the O. And in a situation like that, the O, the individual, in my case, the different gender, is more visible, and what they do is more public. So their mistakes are also more public. And sometimes they feel like they're thought to represent everybody who's an O. It was really helpful when he told me about this because it put some of the things that I experienced into a context where it wasn't me and it wasn't my colleagues. It was just what happens when a new type of individual joins a group. And this stuck with me for my entire career and is a dynamic that I think about not just with gender, and that I also welcome others to consider it with their situation, because it actually helps a great deal to realize that it's not really necessarily you. It's the situation, and that helps a lot.
Yeah, it seems like whenever you're the only of a certain demographic, that thinking of it that way could really help.
Exactly. That's a
Yeah.
really good way to put it, Laura. When you're the only,
Yeah.
there is a dynamic that has nothing to do with you.
And we had talked earlier about also dynamics among colleagues related to gender, about sometimes, and maybe it's just being the only again, but feeling like you would say something and it wouldn't be listened to, but a colleague would say it sometimes and it would be listened to. Is that something that you feel comfortable talking a little more?
Yeah, I suspect you have run into this as well.
I have, yes.
Where you make a comment and everybody's like, okay. And then 5 minutes later, in this case where we're talking about gender, a man who is otherwise of the same status as you makes the same comment, and suddenly, oh, this is his idea. It's a great idea. So one of the things that made a huge difference to me was when my department then hired a somewhat more senior colleague who's a woman, Maureen Hansen, who had experienced this herself. And she was hired tenured and I didn't have tenure. So I would never correct someone if they said that this was so-and-so's idea when it was really mine. But as soon as Maureen came to our faculty meetings, she took on this dynamic. And so I would say something, nothing would happen. A man would say it. It would suddenly be his idea. Maureen would then speak up and say, actually, that was Mariana's idea. And that was incredibly important to me, that it got my ideas recognized. But it was also, I really appreciated that she did this, that she called out the dynamic. And after I got tenure, both of us made sure to always do that ourselves in faculty meetings when anyone is somehow being not recognized, no matter who they are. And even if we don't agree with what they said, we make sure they get credit.
Good. So my final question to you is, how have you and your research impacted the scientific community and our society? And this is another way to say this is, why does it matter that you, like immigrant, a woman in science early when there weren't a lot of other women in it, why does it matter that you stayed in STEM?
Okay. That's an interesting question. I can think of a few reasons. One of the things I didn't realize when I first got into science is how much of a people and human endeavor it is. I thought science was like what I had seen in the movies, where a mad scientist would go into a room and go do an experiment and have a brilliant discovery, and that was it. And it was only when I became a faculty member that I realized how much of what a scientist does is work with other people. And I've often said that as much as I love what we've done scientifically, and as much as I think what we found is biologically interesting and important, I think at least as important is the training that this position has allowed me to give other people who are also interested in science and coming up in it. That to me is an extremely rewarding and valuable part of my job. That includes teaching in a classroom, but it also includes the mentoring in my lab, and also includes interactions with people at conferences and other things where we share ideas. To me, that is a really important impact that I can have, perhaps more important than the very specific, this protein works like this impact of our science. Related to that is coming back to what you said in the beginning, is how I can encourage people to just go full steam ahead and not let people get in their way by being supportive of them and what they want to do. So I would say those are the major ways. I could give you more scientific answers. For example, the work that we're doing on how the egg transitions to be an embryo is identifying mechanisms and molecules that are probably, although we find them in flies, they're probably very similar in people. And that knowing these molecules is potentially very important in helping diagnose forms of infertility. For example, determining whether it would make sense for a couple to undertake things like IVF, or whether the eggs produced by the woman, for example, might be unable to develop even in an IVF situation. The work that we do on seminal proteins has a little bit less direct applications, except, and coming from your own contribution, to potentially helping understand how to limit the spread of mosquitoes that transmit serious diseases like dengue and Zika. So there are impacts, but those are very long-term. The biggest impact to me is one of mentoring.
And I'll just add, I agree with all those things, that some of the things I notice about your contributions include, first of all, the most clever titles for papers I've ever seen. So fun. Really nice plays on words. But
we have
also,
a lot of fun.
Yes. But also not necessarily accepting the status quo of how people explain things. And so the example that comes to my mind is that with these seminal fluid proteins, the behavioral ecologists really wanted them to be conflict, right? They really wanted it to be a male manipulating a female's behavior and physiology. And you just kind of refused to take that for granted. Like, yes, it could be that, but it could be, but you yourself and you infused throughout all of us in the lab, like, no, but it could also be cooperation. It could be something totally different. And we just have to see what the evidence says. And you didn't sort of just take it for granted, like a lot of people in the behavioral ecology field did, that it was a conflict between males and females, and that males were manipulating females. And that really influenced the way I think.
Thank you for saying that. I didn't really think about that, but thank you. I think that it comes back to your point about when you're on the intersection of fields, it helps you think in different ways from people in either field. So in this case, I didn't know any behavioral ecology, so I didn't have any preconceived notions.
Right.
And I
that
think
these were manipulative proteins.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, it was like, oh, all right, if you think so, fine. But what about cooperation? And I think that may be part of it. And also, it allows me to say one other thing, which is that sort of came up earlier, but I learned so much from the people that I work with that I would never have even realized until then. And conflict is one example of this. Sexual conflict never even occurred to me until you and others in the lab said, oh, well, actually, the behavioral ecologists think.
Interesting. Well, that is all for today. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, thank you. But thank you so much for having me on and for talking with me and for these really interesting questions. That was really fun to talk about.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
So, Nat, what a pleasure it was to talk to my mentor, Mariana Wolfner. I was wondering what your impressions were of this episode.
Oh, I loved it so much, Laura. There's so many things that I took away from this episode. The caramel effect, which now I'm going to use
so great.
all the time. She coined the term. You heard it here first. That sometimes it's good to be oblivious, which I could go into that more, but I won't. And just this idea of this two-way exchange of mentorship. I loved when she talked about how she learned from you joining her lab, as well as you learning from her. And it's just extra special because you were my mentor. So there's this like mentorship family happening.
Mentorship heart, yes.
Mentorship heart. Mariana's my grand mentor.
Right.
And I just, all the feels in that episode. I really, really liked it.
I just want to say, I don't know if I've ever told you what I've learned from you. We haven't had that love fest yet. So you probably know. Well, I just love that we've developed a friendship, first of all. But also, I never would be doing this podcast without you, right? I didn't have these science communication skills, and you gave me the confidence and the mentorship of how to do something like a podcast. I never would have been able to do that without you. So thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. I think that's, for anyone out there that's in college and you may have a professor that you really look up to, just nurture that relationship, because we're here to tell you that it can be a lifelong friendship and collaboration and all of these wonderful things that have come out of mentors. So I think that pretty much sums it up.
Yeah, it's great. Was there anything else that stuck out to you about the episode?
Yeah, actually, if I can go back to the science for a second.
Yeah, definitely.
I just have to know, is my boyfriend's ejaculate affecting my behavior?
Oh my gosh. That feels very personal.
Well, I need to know.
Yeah, there's some interesting research about it in lots of different animals, not just in insects like Mariana and I study. So could we maybe do that as a topic for another episode?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, thank you so much, Nat. It's great to talk to you as always.
And I want to thank the audience and also our production team, Sam Carmel and Isabel Espinoza. We'll see you next time.